psychologist Dr. Carl Jung said the world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you. And me, I like making videos about the physiology of mitochondria and how I think that knowledge is causing a convergence of science and spirituality, not a divergence. But just remember, I remain suspended in nutritional environmental medicine. I can only work as a specialist in an emergency department of a public hospital, going on for 7 years now. So none of this is medical advice or health advice. It's purely done for educational and entertainment purposes and does not replace a professional relationship with your own medical or healthcare provider. And certainly, I don't think anybody should be jumping in freezing cold water without adequate knowledge and training in the hormetic principles of contrast therapy. So today, this is a quick talk coming from northern New South Wales, where it's pretty cold this morning and the sun's just come up. Nobody else is out yet. And in a few weeks' time, I'm going to be making these videos from some extraordinary locations around the world, hopefully meeting some extraordinary people. So watch out for those. Going to be some incredible cold water opportunities. Amazing mountains and waterfalls. So watch out for those starting in a few weeks' time. But today I want to talk about a very topical subject which is really in its infancy, which is NAD. So what is NAD? NAD stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's made from niacin, which is vitamin B3, or it's produced in small amounts from tryptophan, and some of it is recycled. It's essential for mitochondrial function, and as we get older, levels get lower and lower. And what does it do? Well, it's got four main roles in the body. The first one is energy production. The second is it influences sirtuins, which we've talked about. Third one is it's involved in DNA repair. And the fourth one is that it's involved in cell signaling and communication. So let's look at energy production first. So we know that energy in the body is produced by passing electrons along the inner mitochondrial membrane of our 1 quadrillion mitochondria, which according to science have been around for 1.5 billion years. That energy in the mitochondria is produced by breaking down food into electrons, and also comes from sunlight. Yes, we get free electrons from sunlight. So food is broken down into pyruvate, and then pyruvate is broken down into electrons, and those electrons get passed along the 5 respiratory proteins in the inner mitochondrial membrane to produce ATP, which is the energy currency of our body. Now, of course, you have to have something to pass those electrons along the inner mitochondrial membrane to go through via quantum tunneling, which we've talked about before. Just imagine a giant flock of sheep. I used to have a farm, and I used to love herding the cows and the goats, but herding sheep was a disaster. Cows kind of know where you want to go, and they'll go there often at their own time. But sheep don't really know where you want to go, and even if they did, they'd all head off as quickly as they could in the wrong direction. So we have to have something which carries these electrons in the right direction, and that's what NAD does. And NAD accepts electrons, and when it accepts electrons, NADH is created, which is what carries those electrons. So NAD is the NAD plus, is called NAD plus, accepts the electrons, and NADH is the electron donor. And NAD donates it to the first respiratory protein along the inner mitochondrial membrane. And as it does, it pushes hydrogen, otherwise known as protons, from the matrix of the mitochondria across the inner mitochondrial membrane into the mitochondrial membrane space, which creates a proton gradient. And eventually, once it's passed through the 4 respiratory proteins, all those hydrogens come flooding back across the inner mitochondrial membrane, which spins the ATPase final 5th respiratory protein and creates energy as ATP. And as we've just discussed before, the electrons passing along the inner mitochondrial membrane create chemical energy, and the protons going across the inner mitochondrial membrane create electrical energy. So both chemical and electrical energy is produced by that delicate dance of the electrons passing along the inner mitochondrial membrane and causing hydrogen molecules to be pumped over and back across the inner mitochondrial membrane. Woo! Sunrise and free electrons. And some oysters for breakfast. After the first respiratory protein, the electrons are carried by another well-known electron carrier called coenzyme Q10. What about sirtuins? Well, sirtuins are proteins, and we've discussed that in a previous video, where one of the main roles of sirtuins is to match the demand, the supply and demand of energy production from the mitochondria. You don't want to make too much energy, because you'll deplete your energy stores and burn out too quickly, but you don't want to make enough energy too. And so sirtuins involved in the regulation of that energy production. The third function of NADH, which is a really interesting area of research, which is stabilizing and DNA and correcting any defects in DNA. So there's a lot of new research about using NAD in cancer prevention, because it helps repair DNA defects, and a lot of that research has been done so far in skin cancers and melanoma, which is really interesting. And of course, we have a lot of cells in our body, including 1 quadrillion mitochondria, and those cells have to communicate and signal each other. That's just a fascinating area of research. And they use biophotons to produce that. Biophotons come from mitochondria. They also use NAD as part of that cell signaling and communication process. So let's have a look at some of the consequences of having low NAD. Well, it's actually a low ratio of NAD to NADH, which is called the redox status. And the easiest way to think about that is like a fuel gauge in your car. So let's have a look at some of the consequences of having a low NAD to NADH ratio. Well, there's aging. Certainly been shown that the lower the levels of NAD+, associated with more rapid aging. We've got brain diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and general cognitive decline. We've got various forms of cancer are more likely, particularly skin cancers and melanoma if we have a low NAD to NADH ratio. Cardiovascular diseases. We've got metabolic diseases like diabetes and obesity. We've got sarcopenia, which is generalized muscle loss. You don't get as much bang from your butt going to the gym. Muscles get smaller and weaker. Our immune system, which runs on ATP, remember, the T cells from our immune system, which are involved in hand-to-hand combat with invading microbes, become less energetic. General mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondria produce energy for the cells of the body and in all the cells in our body except for our red blood cells. And there's also a very ancient disease called pellagra, and pellagra results in the 3 Ds of dermatitis, diarrhea and dementia. And that all happens if our redox status gets low. So low levels of NAD plus compared to NADH, which results in a new term that we'll be using in some of our videos now called biogenic failure. It's like the batteries in our torch become dysfunctional. And remember, the batteries can be dysfunctional because they're put in the wrong polarity or just because they're flat. A high NAD to NADH ratio is associated with producing lots of energy and improved mitochondrial efficiency. So we've kind of got 3 new terms that we'll be using in this video, which I'll be using in future videos as well. Biogenic failure, leading to cell death. And biogenic failure, the main reason that happens is because the NAD to NADH ratio goes low. We've got redox status, which is a measure of the NAD to NADH ratio, and is basically the same as looking at the fuel gauge in your car. And we've got intelligent design, which we're going to be talking about in a little bit in this video, which I've used in videos from a long time ago when our good friend Dr. Roby Mitchell was making lots of videos. As I said at the start, there's a ton of new research coming out about NAD to NADH. The trouble is, we kind of know a lot about the science of NAD, point number 1 on the map, and we know a lot about the diseases that you can get from having that low redox status. But the steps from 1 to 10 are much less known about. How do you supplement with NAD? How much should you take? Which form of NAD should you take? Is all a little confusing at the moment, but certainly there's a lot of interest and more information will be coming out about that over the next few years. We do know that boosting NAD levels increases longevity in mice and certainly improves mitochondrial efficiency, but just still a lot to learn about how to take NAD, how to increase levels and the steps involved in that process, because some of the results from the studies have been confusing. So today let's have a look at the relationship that NAD has with some of the other mitochondrial optimization techniques and see if we can link them together. So I've discussed in previous videos about the magic of melatonin in the mitochondria, and certainly we know that the higher your levels of melatonin, the better your redox status, and you also need NAD to create melatonin. And I'm out here now at sunrise, not releasing melatonin, but triggering my mitochondria to start making more melatonin so it can be released tonight. Remembering that 95% of the body's melatonin comes from our mitochondria, only 5% is released by the pineal gland into the cerebrospinal fluid. Of course, if melatonin's involved, vitamin D's got to be involved, and vitamin D increases NAD plus levels, also increases sirtuin levels, and that's how we think that vitamin D is largely involved in the cancer prevention that it's well known for. What about magnesium? Well, magnesium is essential for the activity of the enzymes involved in NAD synthesis, and also, and I didn't know this until recently, I always knew magnesium was critical for mitochondrial function, but we now know that ATP, the end result of mitochondrial function, has to be bound to magnesium for it to be active. So not only does magnesium help optimize ATP production from the mitochondria, you then have to attach ATP to the magnesium for it to provide energy to the body. Methylene blue also improves the NAD to the NADH ratio, as well as decreasing telomere erosion and optimizing electron flow along the inner mitochondrial membrane, which we're going to talk about in future videos. And finally, we need to talk about where we get NAD from. So as I said, most of it comes from niacin or nicotinic acid, same thing, which is vitamin B3, and that's made from a pathway called the Priest-Handler pathway. We get some made from tryptophan, and some of it is recycled from NADH. So the best way of thinking about that, I think, is that it's kind of like those helicopters which you see, because this is about recycling energy. So I was trying to think of a good example of where we're kind of recycling energy. And I think when you see those helicopters at fires carrying the big containers of water they pick up from rivers or ocean, and then they go and drop on the fire, the water eventually evaporates, goes back up into the atmosphere, back down into the rivers. Just blows my mind. That's sometimes why I like getting on waterfalls so much, is the idea that I'm sitting in the same water that was around at the time of Julius Caesar. That water can never be destroyed, just recycled through different forms of the water. So the helicopter picks up the water, throws it on the fire, water evaporates, goes back into the atmosphere, then comes down as rain. So this constant recycling of an energy form which is known as water. Okay, so if we want to get most of our niacin or nicotinic acid, vitamin B3 from foods, which foods have the highest levels? Well, organ meats do. You know, all of us struggling to eat a lot of organic beef liver these days, but certainly that's the highest form of, or the highest source of vitamin B3. Beef is a good source, salmon's a good source, avocados are a good source, and peanuts are a good source. So what do I do to boost my NAD to NADH ratio, my redox status, to increase my fuel gauge, to optimize ATP production from my mitochondria by using that redox status to more efficiently pass that uncoordinated group of sheep, aka electrons, along my inner mitochondrial membrane using quantum tunneling and quantum entanglement? Well, I use a lot of upstream techniques. Now remember, don't do what I do. This is just an educational video. I'm still suspended in nutritional medicine, so this is just for entertainment. But here's what I do. I have taken action to increase the foods high in vitamin B3, and also that's very useful because we do know that there's a lot of research coming out about vitamin B3 in protecting our skin from excessive UV light from sunlight. So, and because I'm such a fan of sunlight, which donates electrons to my mitochondria, so I don't have a lot of liver these days. I have cod liver oil. I have a lot of wild salmon. I never eat farm salmon, just wild salmon. I have beef relatively frequently, but I'm very choosy about what beef I get. Fortunately, I have good friends who are biodynamic beef farmers and biodynamic sheep farmers. What does biodynamic mean? Well, it means that not only is it organic, but it means the farmers are passionate about remineralizing the soil, knowing that the healthier that the grass that the animals eat, the healthier the meat will be for us. I take a niacin supplement, the flushing version. I only take 100 milligrams a day, which is a very small dose, and I take it when I have a fatty meal to avoid the flush. I take magnesium because I'm a magnesium junkie, involved in 300 enzymatic processes in the body. And as we know, it's also, as we now know, not only is it critical for optimal mitochondrial function, ATP has to be attached for magnesium to actually provide the energy for us. Methylene blue, I take a little bit of methylene blue. And finally, I do as much as I can, as we know, to maintain my melatonin levels. How do I do that? Well, I see the sunrise every morning. Woo! To set my circadian clock for the day. Remember, the circadian clock is in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the brain, and that is set by sunlight on my retina, communicating from a light energy to a chemical energy done by DHA, which is one of the 2 omega-3 fatty acids we get from seafood, converts it into a signal which sets a circadian clock in my suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then is responsible for setting all the peripheral clocks. Every cell in our body, every organ has its own peripheral clock, which means that all our organ functions are coordinated to happen at the right time. So I see the sunrise. I also make sure I see the sunset as often as I can. So sunrise sets my circadian clock, also gives a signal to start from my mitochondria to start producing melatonin, and seeing the sunrise at night means that it's the signal for my mitochondria and pineal gland to start releasing that melatonin. Melatonin, a 3 billion year old molecule, unchanged in 3 billion years in its perfect function. Not many things in life which are unchanged in 3 billion years because of perfect function. And that melatonin is critical for the health of the mitochondria, particularly the inner mitochondrial membrane. It's also involved in the quantum physics of the electron tunneling and electron entanglement. Remember, the electron tunneling is like a train being able to go through a hill, and the quantum entanglement is like those flocks of birds which can fly, thousands of them, as if they were one bird, that we see them flying around in the sky. So the sunrise causes the production of melatonin, the sunset causes the release of melatonin. However, if I, after the sunset, get exposed to artificial blue light, which is either from computer screens or phone screens or the LED lights in our roof, then that melatonin production gets shut off, because the light tells our body what time it is, and blue light is highest at midday. What a red light in the sky now. By midday, be mainly blue light. So if we put on all these screens and lights at night, it tells our body it's midday, so don't want to be sleepy at midday, so the body switches off the melatonin release. So I have to remind my body that it's still nighttime. Well, how do I do that? Well, I have red lights in my house, which means I don't have to have the blue LED lights on. And you can get great lighting now, and I've mentioned before that a lot of the US hospitals now are moving to circadian lighting, which means the LED lights change automatically with whatever time of day to have a more natural balance of the different colours of light. Red light highest in the morning and in the evening. And I, of course, always use my blue light blocking glasses when I'm on screens or in the evenings. You get to look stupid like this with the red light glasses on, or you saw me with the yellow light ones on. There are clear ones, there are yellow ones, there are red ones. They all block different levels of blue light. So kind of like the circadian lighting in the hospital roofs, which change them automatically. I change the lenses of the glasses that I use, and at night I mainly use the red ones because they block the most blue light. So yeah, I'd rather look like a bit of a goose than shut off my melatonin levels. Well, as you can see, I'm no longer in northern New South Wales. I'm down near Dalesford in rural Victoria. For all my Texas friends, that's right at the bottom of Australia. down here on a very quick yoga intensive, and I realised when I was putting the video together that my giant 6 a.m. fingers hadn't hit the record button properly on one segment of the video, which was about the upstream, downstream, intelligent design concept of how to decide how I'm going to take the supplement. And on my trip down here, I kind of thought of a metaphor explaining that. And because how I got here was that I caught an Uber early this morning from my place to Gold Coast Airport, and then I flew into Melbourne Airport, drove to Dalesford, got out, had a look at a favourite herbal shop of mine, which I'll tell you about in a second, kept driving to the yoga retreat, walked to my cabin. The alternative is, if I had $1 billion and there was such thing as a helicopter that could fly that far, is I'd get a helicopter to pick me up at my house on my helipad and drop me straight at the yoga retreat. The advantage of that is I'm going to get here a lot quicker. I'm going to be guaranteed, almost guaranteed I get here, because I'm not going to be distracted by stuff along the way. The disadvantage is that it's very expensive, and I miss out on the advantage of coming the slow way, which is the journey is a big part of the adventure. If I'd taken a helicopter, I wouldn't have been able to stop in at Enki Herbal Cafe in Dalesford, where they have a great range of medicinal drinks and spagyric herbs. So in terms of NAD, the metaphor translates to I can get vitamin B3 by eating liver. The vitamin B3 gets absorbed, then gets converted into its metabolites, nicotinamide riboside and nicotinamide mononucleotide, and they then get converted to NAD, relying on the intelligent design of the body to make those conversions as it sees fit. The alternative is I get an intravenous infusion of straight NAD, which of course is a lot more expensive, but the process happens a lot quicker, but I do miss out on the intelligent design of the body using the metabolites as it sees fit. So my options in terms of getting more NAD starts upstream at liver, which then I can absorb the vitamin B3 from, which then gets converted to nicotinamide riboside or nicotinamide mononucleotide, which then gets converted to NAD. So one strategy starts upstream at liver and ends downstream at NAD. The other strategy starts with NAD. Now I choose, for me, to take some niacin because it's very cheap, and I rely on the intelligent design of my body to utilise it as it sees fit. I also don't do NAD infusions because they're very expensive, and they come in a plastic bag of saline, which at the moment I'm trying to keep as clear of plastic as I can. I suppose in medicine, most downstream is a drug. So there are examples of where that's useful. Adenosine is an amino acid from proteins, but it's got a peculiar ability to revert some forms of arrhythmia. The thing is, you've got 10 seconds to get it to the heart, so you have to give it by a very quick intravenous bolus push. Me eating some steak to get some adenosine is just not going to convert that arrhythmia in an emergency department. So sometimes you've got to decide what's the most appropriate for the situation I'm in. So adenosine is a good example of a downstream drug effect. Now another really good example of an upstream effect is turmeric. So turmeric, as we know, is very medicinal, but it's not very well absorbed. Only about 30% of it gets absorbed. Versus curcumin, particularly if it's liposomal, a lot more of it gets absorbed. So what you choose really depends on your goals. One of the interesting things about turmeric was researchers showed that even though only 30% of it was absorbed, 70% of it ended up in the colon, and people who consumed a lot of turmeric had a much lower incidence of colorectal cancer. So when you think about it, that's a pretty good strategy, because the colon is a fairly toxic place, and toxic places can benefit from some therapeutic agent. So the idea of putting some medicine like turmeric down to the colon is probably a good idea for some people. Whereas if you want a specific effect from the curcumin, much better take a curcumin supplement. All right, at the end of the video, I've got a couple of short reels from Enki Herbals in Dalesford, which is a cool place to visit if you're down there. And finally, I always find it fascinating in all the spiritual texts that I've been reading, how many references there are to light. And then we've got 3 billion year old mitochondria and melatonin performing quantum physics to pass electrons along the inner mitochondrial membrane. So all of this stuff on the complexity of NAD and melatonin, well, the simplicity as well. The simplicity, yet the complexity, and then their ability to herd thousands of crazy electrons along through proteins by quantum physics of quantum tunneling and quantum entanglement. And I think that's just some really good evidence for me anyway that this is a lot more than just a random collection of sea minerals coming together by accident. And I think for me, and I'm going to make more videos about this, is science is providing increasing evidence that converges science and spirituality rather than diverges them. So that's enough for me. Got to go get fit and organised for my upcoming trip. But remember, as the Navy SEALs say, no matter how much it hurts, how dark it gets, or how far you fall, you are never out of the fight. Don't give up. See you next time. Thanks for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video if you like, because it helps YouTube get the message out, and this information isn't useful for people if they don't know about it. So thanks for subscribing. Thanks for liking. Have a great day. See you next time. Peace and love. Bye.
Let's see the world together. Let's try to see it all.